A critical operation has arrived from Ukraine. The Russian army has started to suffer very serious problems in response to this. When Putin saw that Ukraine was doing wonders with unmanned aerial vehicles, he went crazy with anger and he ordered a large number of unmanned aerial vehicles. But after that, he was faced with a very big surprise. The long-range Patriots of the Ukrainian army and the intelligence team had begun to land blows back-to-back in all areas. However, Putin has ordered more unmanned aerial vehicles, but at this point, the Ukrainian army took the unmanned aerial vehicles out of Russia's hands. And after that, he organized a mind-blowing operation in Bakhmut in the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The Ukrainian army began to take the lead very seriously. Ukraine, which has squeezed the Russians in almost every geography, began to announce the footsteps of victory to the whole world. If it goes this way, it is expected that Ukraine will reach a higher point in a short time. At the heart of the incredible operations of the Ukrainian army were unmanned aerial vehicles that evaluated all kinds of vulnerabilities of the Russians. These vehicles would prepare the ground for the absolute victory of the Ukrainian army to win the war in many areas. Realizing this, Putin made a critical decision and he has allocated a budget to purchase unmanned aerial vehicles in his army, the number of which is quite limited. But there have been numerous operations that will make him regret this decision. The Ukrainian army was always getting ahead of the Russians by blowing up different headquarters. This situation was of a nature that would increase all the effects of the ongoing war in the Ukrainian region. In response to such a successful situation, Putin ordered about 1,000 unmanned aerial vehicles. This shipment, which Iran undertook, would be life water for the Russians. But the fact that the Russian army met a painful truth in its operations attracted the attention of the whole world. While Russian soldiers were trying to use these unmanned aerial vehicles, they could not prevent their precise fall. Thinking that this was a sabotage, Putin could not find any solution, although he conducted intensive scans with the army. This is exactly at this point he decided to place new orders. But despite this, all the plans of the Russian army have started to turn upside down. Although Putin wanted to use unmanned aerial vehicles in these regions, the vehicles would explode on their own or become easy targets by Patriot air defense systems. As a solution to this, he decided to send all the remaining unmanned aerial vehicles to Iran and buy new ones. Putin began to think about the possibility that some of the unmanned aerial vehicles were also sabotaged, but he didn't say much. Because of this kind of speculation is heard in the Russian media, it will turn out how superior Ukraine is. While it is known that the orders were transmitted to Iran by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it was at this point that the Ukrainian army came up with an inconceivable idea and the Russians got into a very difficult position. The Ukrainian army knew that Iran was the only country that would sell unmanned aerial vehicles to the Russians. Because of this, he had recently sent too many agents to that region. The Russian Defense Ministry has requested that the unmanned aerial vehicles be sent after about 3 weeks because there are problems within the army. At this point, it was thought that Putin would conduct research to identify all possible rebels within the army. But after the Iranian delegates held a meeting with the Russian Defense Ministry, Ukrainian agents demanded an interview from Iran as if they were members of the Russian Defense Ministry. Although Iran did a very subtle research at this point, it failed to realize that the arrivals were Ukrainian agents. He stated that the necessary screening of the Russian army was carried out and the unmanned aerial vehicles could be taken delivery within 2 weeks. After that, Ukraine demanded to be brought to Belgorod by changing the delivery point, which is the Krasnodar airport, in order to be able to carry out a comfortable operation. Iranian officials who were not suspicious of the incident accepted this, and the Ukrainian army began to wait for the shipment that was coming to Belgorod. It is precisely at this point that a very big problem has been revealed inside Russia, and the Ukrainian army has taken the step to turn this to its advantage. The Ukrainian army focused on secretly sending a large number of its soldiers near Belgorod and successfully intercepting the shipment. An elite unit selected from the Ukrainian Special Forces was sent to this point. However, the Ukrainian army was now ready in every way but close to the day of shipment. Various statements began to come from Wagner mercenary group Yevgeny Prigozhin back to back. Prigozhin, who had been annoyed by the current situation for some time, began to withdraw his troops as if he was preparing to make a move soon. Realizing this, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has taken another different step that will completely confuse this situation, and the Russian army was mixed up in an instant. With this, the Ukrainian army had the opportunity of its life. Prigozhin made critical statements together with Wagner. He said that he would march to Moscow and demand accountability from all those who unsuccessfully led the Russian army. But the more troubling part of this was the allegations and threats he made, especially about Sergei Shoigu. He said that if he wants Wagner to stop, Putin should urgently hang Shoigu on Red Square. After that, the Ukrainian army realized how important this opportunity was, and from about 20 of Belgorod, it gradually began to move towards the airport. The fact that Prigozhin was a very popular person among the people would have enabled the coup to attract more support. Shoigu, on the other hand, was missing that evening, afraid of the possibility that Prigozhin would do what he said. Shoigu went into hiding in a nearby nuclear bunker. However, the unmanned aerial vehicles had not been recalled by anyone due to the possibility of a management change. And thanks to this, the Ukrainian army informed the center he has requested that the best drone operators he has will be sent here soon. Ukrainian Special Forces, while they were going to carry out this operation. Another critical news came from Russia. Wagner had captured Rostov. With this news, the Ukrainian army has decided to launch an operation. The Ukrainian army has started moving towards the coordinates set for the operation. After the passage of the 2-week process, Iranian units acting punctually had brought unmanned aerial vehicles. Some of the personnel at this military airport had joined the Wagner ranks to participate in the coup, while another part had tried to use radios to inform the Kremlin. But Putin had cut off these radios on the grounds that they would help organize the coup. This caused the staff on duty not to know what to do. As a result of the absence of the appropriate operator in this region, he began to wait compulsorily. At this point, a great idea came to the mind of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian soldiers who had Wagner uniforms would behave as if Wagner had taken over these unmanned aerial vehicles. And while this would increase the fear in the Kremlin, it would prepare the ground for the issuance of a red alert. The Ukrainian army entered the airport in Belgorod in a short operation using Wagner uniforms. The staff in that area wanted to clash because they were aware of the coup attempt. But he had sent the strongest soldiers of the Ukrainian army in this region. After a short firefight, the Russian personnel were forced to surrender, but the Ukrainian army did not take these personnel prisoner. On the contrary, he gave them one of the armored vehicles, allowing them to escape from here. This was part of the incredible plan of the Ukrainian army. After that, the Ukrainian army began sending all unmanned aerial vehicles towards the nearby airport, thanks to the operators who will use unmanned aerial vehicles. While this process was going on, the Russian army, unable to intervene in Belgorod, had to monitor the process. It was precisely at this moment that the Kremlin became aware of the situation and declared a state of emergency in the Kremlin. Putin made the critical decision when military personnel who reached one of the nearby military headquarters said that the unmanned aerial vehicles had been picked up by Wagner, and he mobilized the S-400s in Bakhmut, which prevented the Ukrainian army from conducting airstrikes in this region to go to Moscow. This is the beginning of the end for the Russians on the territory of Ukraine. After these developments, Putin quickly brought them to Moscow. Prigozhin, on the other hand, met with Belarusian leader Lukashenko and agreed to make peace with Putin. Nevertheless, a deep sense of relief enveloped Putin. Members of the Russian Defense Ministry who met with Prigozhin and Wagner members told where the unmanned aerial vehicles are located and that they urgently need to be delivered to the Russian military. But the Wagner members did not know about this incident. In fact, there was no one in Wagner who could be a drone operator. Therefore, it became clear that Wagner was telling the truth. After that, when I said that Ukraine remained the only suspect, Ukraine organized that operation that will astonish the whole world with the unmanned aerial vehicles that fell into its hands. Putin could not say that Ukraine had taken away the unmanned aerial vehicles by conducting cross-border operations because this would make the Putin administration look completely powerless. And it would have been possible for the public revolt, which has already reacted quite a lot against the Putin administration, to grow even more. That's why thinking that Ukraine will not use these unmanned aerial vehicles anytime soon, it left its air defense systems in Moscow. The difference between Ukraine attacking the fronts where the war is located or carrying out cross-border deconfliction was huge, but the Ukrainian army took action faster than expected, and he gave hell to the Russian soldiers stationed in the Ukrainian region. The Ukrainian military has sent some of its unmanned aerial vehicles primarily to gather intelligence in these regions and guarantee the operation for military headquarters located in Bakhmut have been identified. They had not made sufficient preparations because they thought they were protected against attacks from the air. Taking this opportunity, the Ukrainian army has started sending unmanned aerial vehicles from the center of Bakhmut to the military headquarters, which are 15 and 20 centimeters behind respectively. If these unmanned aerial vehicles were not enough, the most important missiles known as the secret weapon of the United States would be fired. This would deal the biggest blow to the Russian army so far. When this inconceivable plan of the Ukrainian army came into play, the Russians looked for a hole to escape from in Bakhmut. Unmanned aerial vehicles dominated the geography of the region. Back-to-back bombardments of Russian military headquarters began to be organized. However, the Russian soldiers immediately moved to retreat. While they thought they were protected from air attacks, they were faced with a very big surprise. Thanks to this step, the Ukrainian army evacuated all three headquarters, with the Russians leaving the battlefield one by one. The victory in Bakhmut was in many ways the victory of the Ukrainian army. But it was precisely at this point that Putin became aware of the headquarters raids, and he decided to send a convoy carrying a large amount of ammunition from an ammunition depot located in one of the nearby areas towards this area. Just when this step was going to put Putin right in front, the Ukrainian army took a huge step thanks to its superior intelligence network. And for Russian soldiers, one of their last days in the Ukrainian region has happened. When the Ukrainian army learned that a convoy protected by armored vehicles was coming to this region, it began to identify all the routes near the headquarters they had recaptured when it was determined by the Ukrainian army that only one of these routes was capable of supporting all headquarters. Things completely changed. The Ukrainian soldiers immediately took action, and with the order they received from the Ukrainian army, they took action to place the ammunition they had on this route, about 5 cm away from Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army began to wait for news from the observer units it had deployed further forward. Putin, who thinks he will lose this region from his hands, has sent one of the largest convoys he has sent to Ukraine so far. But he could never have guessed that the Ukrainian army had such good intelligence. The Ukrainian army is deployed on both sides of the road. He wanted to guarantee the operation thanks to the rocket launchers he placed towards the hillside. After that, remote-controlled C4s were placed by the Ukrainian army along the road. Immediately after this operation was completed, news came from the observer troops and the Ukrainian army took its place. When the Russian convoy arrived in this area, it was quite well protected, but it could not detect the remote-controlled C4s. The Russian soldiers were surprised by what happened after the front armored vehicle was detonated by remote-controlled force. Although the Russians, who wanted to respond to the Ukrainian army, immediately got out of the vehicle, they were faced with a very large operation. Ukraine had started firing back-to-back from two slopes. However, some of the Russians turned to vehicles to escape. But the Ukrainian army also hit the rearmost vehicle with a rocket launcher fired from the hillside. This has completely cornered the Russian soldiers. As the conflict continued, many of the soldiers decided to surrender. But in response to the conflicting minority, the Ukrainian army has taken a very big step, and by detonating the rest of the remote-controlled C4s that he didn't detonate, he completely cornered the Russian army. The sound of the explosion echoed in that area. The biggest reason why this explosion was so big was that it came from a truck carrying explosives. After that, the Russian soldiers decided to surrender in horror, and the Ukrainian army has signaled to the whole world how long it will continue its dominance in Bakhmut. Following it, the Ukrainian army advanced the situation marginally, and he made certain that Russian soldiers could not take refuge here. The Russian army had to withdraw 20,000 men to Belgorod. Putin, who was enraged by the operation, signed a vital decision. And despite his desire to destroy Ukraine, he faced major foreign policy challenges. The Ukrainian army began to conduct radically diverse actions in the final days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Ukrainian soldiers who began preparing for the spring offensive began to take the lead in all areas and make effective use of the help they got. As a result of this approach, it has also been disclosed that the Ukrainian army has begun preparation to finish the battle in a variety of places. This action, which ended the presence of the Russian army in Luhansk, was considered as a part of Action Spring since the commencement of the Russian-Ukrainian War. The Ukrainian army has received backing that has enabled it to aggressively progress in several locations. Initially, a hypothetical 3 was given a lot of help in order for the Ukrainian army to protect itself. The World War I front lines had been closed following these recent declarations as the Ukrainian army began to plan several operations to end the conflict against the Russians. Western countries began to contribute significant assistance, and many countries that have changed their stance are now rallying for Ukraine to conduct an offensive that will end the war rather than self. At this period, the most important credited tanks played a significant role. And owing to these tanks, the Ukrainian army inflicted such a blow to the Russians that everything shifted in Ukraine's favor. The Ukrainian army had opted to conduct a thorough evaluation of the ammunition and equipment that would be used in the spring operation beforehand. As a result of this decision, Ukrainian soldiers who will be actively participating in a variety of regions have decided to put their power to the test in reaction to the Russian army's operations in Luhansk. The Russian army adopted a mind-boggling technique in this region before the next spring operation, causing hell for Russian soldiers. And he disclosed using data how much the Ukrainian army has recently strengthened. The Ukrainian army has begun preparing the tank support it will get from Western countries specifically for this operation. This operation, which will be entered directly into the Russian army from the opposite direction, presented a radically different idea, recognizing that the soldiers on the front lines of Luhansk confronting Ukraine were hesitant. Ukrainian troops opted to launch an offensive immediately from this territory. The Ukrainian army, unaware that it would gain a crucial victory over the Russians in this territory, acted promptly after finishing its preparations. The Ukrainian army acknowledged that it has a substantial number of armored vehicles as well as tanks. He also triggered the signal jewel tiers that he had sent to Ukrainian agents on the Luhansk front. These signal jammers would be unable to inform Russian soldiers behind the front lines of the size of the army advancing towards them with the first sight of its tanks on the front lines. The Ukrainian army initiated the operation despite the fact that Russian soldiers had won significant resistance in this region. They had little chance against Ukraine when the Ukrainian army attacked the Russians. The Russian soldiers that counterattacked were taken aback by what they saw. Ukraine's tanks did not operate in the manner represented in Putin's propaganda. He possessed the ability to spread the Russian army's location in this location. The Russian army also had tanks. However, he was unable to oppose Ukraine because Ukraine's tanks were capable of penetrating the armor of everything in this region. After a while, the Russian army, unable to stand up to overwhelming force, was forced to retreat. However, for the Ukrainian army had already decided what moves it would take in this area. And now he's on the offensive. The Russians on the other side, who intended to inform the previous front, were in for a huge surprise. While the Ukrainian army advanced in this territory, a group of Ukrainians fleeing the Russians to the other front reported that Ukraine had come in quite strong and crushed everything in its path. Russian forces, however, did not believe this, believing that they could defeat the Ukrainian army. But when he saw the Ukrainian army approaching from the other side, he began to retreat in big numbers. A section of the front line retreated toward Belgorod. Despite their best efforts, the second party was unable to maintain the resistance and was forced to retreat as well. When the Ukrainian army reclaimed this region, it did so with great delight. When Putin learned of this latest development, he erupted in rage and he made the crucial choice. The Russian military believed it was on the verge of defeating Ukraine. However, recent events have proven that this strategy is not sufficiently clear if he continues in this manner. The Ukrainian army is expected to score one of its most significant victories against the Russians in a very short period of time. Putin, on the other hand, proceeded to make pretty extreme actions, even withdrawing from territory that he had captured. If these developments continue, one of the most significant issues will be the Russians' inability to take even the smallest step against Ukraine in a short period of time. It is plausible to argue that Putin, who was compelled to retreat from these regions, even resigned in a short period of time because Putin is making steps in each of the places he controls with the expectation that they will be permanent. Every retreat of Putin, who has erected headquarters in these locations and deployed tanks and armaments to these districts, is known to leave Russia with a very big bill. Putin cannot foresee exactly what he will do, knowing that these bills are laying the groundwork for the disadvantages of operations to be organized in Ukraine in the continuance of these bills. If this trend continues, individuals who recognize Russia's impending insolvency will seek relief by threatening several countries. Among these countries is the United Kingdom, which is widely acknowledged to be critical in many sectors. Even when information that threatened Boris Johnson's words previously emerged and Kremlin officials instantly rejected it, matters in this region remain complicated. It is unclear what kind of policy the Russian army will pursue now that it realizes it has no prospect of winning against Ukraine. However, the comments made by war analysts on this problem will astound the entire world. According to military specialists, the Ukrainian army will take more aggressive measures against the Russians in the near future. Among these steps are those that will assure that the Russian army continues to deteriorate on a daily basis. Many of these were based on the Ukrainian army's ongoing advantage over the Russians. If this mindset persists, Ukraine will no longer need to consider previous phases of the war. The Russians claim that they have not been able to take even the smallest step against Ukraine in order to maintain the victories they have made in numerous places. And the sole reason for this is Putin, who as usual enters the picture with his bad policies. By repeating these errors, Putin exposes his foreign policy failure to the entire world by constantly threatening groupings in which many countries are involved. If such scenarios continue, the Ukrainian army will use the embargoes imposed on Russia to its advantage by gaining so much international backing in such a short period of time. Along with this condition, the Russian people's attempts to rebel increase dramatically with the Ukrainian army's assistance for such breakthroughs. It is believed that there will be more large uprisings against Putin in the near future, notwithstanding the Russian people's continued distrust of Putin. And if Russia faces significant upheaval, things are likely to become even more problematic. And if the Ukrainian army uses such difficulties to its advantage, Russia will have no chance. A major resignation wind is likely to start in the Kremlin as a result of the development of the protests in the Russian army. However, It is also said in the lobbies that Putin is the first name to go. The Russians began to rebel. After these two missions, tens of thousands of Russian citizens dispatched by Vladimir Putin to Ukraine's land are attempting to flee the tolerance of Russian people transferred to occupied parts of Ukraine by the Russian army has worn out. The globe was stunned by the miles-long line that formed at the Russian border after the Russian army invaded Ukraine on February 24 last year. It captured the Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Luhansk regions on Ukrainian territory and held an unlawful referendum there. Vladimir Putin, who declared that he annexed these territories following the orchestrated referendum, says that they are now Russian territory. However, the United States and Western countries did not accept Putin's decision to acquire this territory. Vladimir Putin, who intends to conduct another referendum in the future, compelled these people to live within Russian borders in order to minimize the number of Ukrainian citizens in these areas. Putin dispatched a huge number of Russian authorities to Ukrainian territory, and Russian passports were issued to Ukrainian nationals soon after Putin began sending Russian people to the 4 districts he occupied with the intention of having these Russian citizens vote in future referendums to ensure that these 4 territories were formally designated Russian territory. However, things did not go as planned and Putin's plan failed. Tens of thousands of Russian people deported to Ukraine rebelled and attempted to re-enter Russia. However, Russian border guards refused to let these citizens enter the nation, and a lengthy line developed on the Russian border in terms of the news specifics. The action in the 4 major regions held by the Russian army on Ukrainian soil, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Kherson, and Luhansk, shocked everyone. In order to seize these lands, the Russian army broke many norms of war and destroyed many cities. A significant number of Russian employees were dispatched to Ukraine's land to clean up the devastation in the 4 areas acquired by Vladimir Putin. And these cities began to be rebuilt. Putin, who has begun to restore these cities, has also relocated tens of thousands of Russian nationals. Russian President Vladimir Putin has promised Russian residents who have settled in these areas land, housing, and salary. Putin, who intends to decrease the number of Ukrainians residing in the region to a minority and declare these areas Russian sovereignty, has continued to transfer Russian residents to these cities on a monthly basis. However, the terrible conditions generated by the war eventually wore down the patience of Russian citizens residing here. Putin, who has struggled to supply weapons and ammunition to the Russian army due to Russia's ongoing economic crisis, has also failed to keep the pledges he made to the Russian citizens he dispatched. With the interruption of the money that the government regularly distributes, Russian citizens began to be unable to continue their livelihoods. As a result, Russian residents in Ukraine's Luhansk region began to rebel. The workers deployed by Vladimir Putin to Ukraine's territory, however, were the first to start this uprising. Russian employees hired to restore the city's damaged areas went on strike, claiming that they had not been paid in a long time. However, in order to prevent the strike of these Russian workers in Ukraine from being heard, the Russian government has imposed a broadcasting embargo in Russia. However, numerous Western and U.S. media outlets covered the strikers as Russian workers revolted. Russian civilians in the Luhansk region flocked to the streets to denounce Vladimir Putin. However, no outcomes were obtained as a result of these protests. Soon after, the Ukrainian army began to organize large-scale operations to reclaim the Russian army's occupied regions. With the battle resuming in these places, Russian citizens who had lived in these areas for a long time began to flee the cities fast. Russian people from Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Kherson have begun to return to Russia in large numbers. However, the Russian government prevented these citizens from entering Russia by barring border crossing because Russian border guards refused to let tens of thousands of Russian nationals enter the country. Enormous lines formed at the Russian border with the patience of Russian citizens who had not been escorted inside the Russian border wearing thin. A large scuffle broke out between Russian border guards and Russian citizens. Russian citizens who are still attempting to enter Russia are awaiting the opening of the border gates. This assimilation policy, which Vladimir Putin has been implementing for many years, is now well known around the world. When the Russian army occupied the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, it also moved a substantial number of Russian people there and began an assimilation effort. The presence of so many minorities and pro-Ukrainian individuals on Crimean territory posed a significant danger to Putin. As a result, Putin permitted Russian people to live in Crimea in exchange for numerous economic benefits. This battle between Russia and Ukraine has offered a tremendous chance for Vladimir Putin's assimilation program, which Putin has not rejected. When the Russian army's advance of Ukrainian land slowed and the Russian army began to lose the war, Vladimir Putin declared partial mobilization with this decision. Almost 300,000 Russian civilians were compelled to join the Russian army and fight on Ukrainian soil. However, minorities living in Russia made up more than half of those included minority citizens, were relocated to Ukraine's territory, primarily from autonomous republics such as Crimea, Dagestan, and Chechnya. As a result, Vladimir Putin could both recruit more soldiers and accelerate the integration agenda he has been pursuing for years. However, after a while, these minority people became a major source of contention for Putin. Russian and Wagner forces began to regard the minority of soldiers fighting for Vladimir Putin on Ukrainian land as second-class fighters. The Russian government, on the other hand, did not send adequate weapons, ammunition, medications, and supplies to these minority soldiers. While Putin provided ample military materials for his own troops, minority soldiers were unable to profit from these supplies. After a while, the minority of soldiers decided to unify and lay down their guns in protest of Putin. A minority of soldiers who claimed Putin ordered their death stated the Russian government failed to supply them with food and medicine. However, this was not the only issue. Russian leaders were fighting against these minority soldiers on the front lines. Previously, a small group of Dagestani soldiers who managed to flee to Ukraine admitted that Russian commanders were hiding behind the front lines and utilizing them as a leading force. Protests began to be planned within Russia's borders after hearing about the treatment of minority soldiers fighting for Putin on Ukrainian soil. Protests that began in the autonomous region of Dagestan, which is located within Russia's boundaries, have expanded rapidly. People of Dagestan began to organize protests calling for the release of minority people who had been drafted into the Russian army. Russian security personnel intervened when citizens of Dagestan toured cities and anti-war slogans. Putin, who had been prepared owing to anti-war protests organized within Russia's borders, promptly dispatched Russian security forces to the region. Protests by Dagestani citizens were crushed following the brawls. A substantial number of minority citizens, however, were detained. According to independent Russian news outlets, tens of thousands of Russian citizens have been jailed in Russia since the start of the war. Similarly, a substantial number of Russian citizens were imprisoned for disrespecting the Russian army. It is currently illegal within Russian borders to broadcast news that vilifies the Russian army or is anti-war. Vladimir Putin continues to oppress his own people in his usual tyrannical manner.